Welcome to episode 30 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, before we get going with the main business of this episode of the podcast, I just want to take a few moments to reflect upon the last 12 months, really. It's been a busy period for the podcast. I've produced 16 podcasts. This is number 16 since March of 2020. And the reason why I've been able to produce so many podcasts is because, obviously, of the time that I've been given by the coronavirus pandemic. Today is the 11th of March 2021, and according to the radio this morning, according to the news this morning, the World Health Organization declared the pandemic back on the 11th of March 2020. So it's exactly a year, officially, since the pandemic has been sweeping around the world. And I think for everybody, the pandemic has had some very negative effects. I don't spend all my life making these podcasts or maintaining the website, cyclingeurope.org, or cycling or writing the books that I've written. I do have jobs. I work in an arts centre here in Yorkshire. I'm also a teacher, and both of those jobs have been severely affected by the coronavirus. For many, many months, I haven't been able to do either of them, and only the teaching has really now started to kick in again. But the time that gave me meant I could make a lot of podcasts, and I just want to say thank you to the many people who've actually been interviewed on those 16 episodes of the Cycling Europe podcast in the last 12 months, starting with Paul Gentle. That was episode 15 back in March of 2020. He talked about his own trip from Tarifa to Nordkapp up in the north of Norway, which had to be abandoned in Nice in southern France because of the arrival of the coronavirus. Also spoke to Mark Beaumont, somebody who I've followed for many, many years. That was a real opportunity. He was stuck at home painting his garage, I think, when I spoke to him. Then we had the Welsh trio of Geraint, Owen and Gareth, who together with a group of friends have been cycling around Europe for 12 years, and I had an opportunity to chat with them back in April. Ed Lancaster of the ECF, the European Cyclists Federation, who are responsible for the Eurovelo network. Spoke to him in May. I think at the time we were all hoping that we might be able to escape to the continent. For most of us, that wasn't the case back in 2020. Episode 19, Abigail Melton and Lilith Cooper, the Gears for Queers duo who'd written a book about cycling across Europe. And then Ian Finlay, who talked to me about cycling around the world. And again, his plans had been put on hold because of the coronavirus pandemic. Episode 21 was a bit of a special one because it was more of a documentary where I interviewed a few people about the life and travels of Maximilian J. St. George, who back in 1908 and 1909 travelled around Europe for 16,000 miles, I think it was. And then Helen Cook and Susan Dorham helped me celebrate the Women's Festival of Cycling in episode 22 in July. I did manage to get out on my own bike and travel around the UK in the summer of 2020, cycling up to Edinburgh, then Belfast, then Cardiff, and then finally down to London. And during that trip, I managed to make a couple of podcasts, not really about the trip itself, but I met up with Rob Ainsley and talked to him about quirky ideas for cycling trips. That included interviews with David Haywood and James Briggs, who come up with their own ideas for rather interesting tours. That was episode 23. And then when I arrived in London, I arranged to meet up with Dr. Stephen Fabes. He's the guy who cycled around the world for 5 years, and he was about to release his book, Signs of Life, which has now been published, and it's a good read. I recommend it. Then into the autumn, in September, spoke to Ryan Van Duzer, who has a very popular YouTube channel. He was an infectiously enthusiastic American based in Boulder, Colorado. And then Sarah Mitchell, the new CEO of Cycling UK. Dr. Ian Walker was episode 27. He talked about, again, a cycle from the very northernmost point of Europe at Nordkapp down to Tarifa, the southernmost point. But he broke the world record for doing it in just 16 days and 20 hours. Took me over 100 days when I did it in the other direction back in 2015. Then episode 28, earlier this year, Simon Parker, the journalist who'd cycled many places around the world, but spoke specifically about his cycle and the documentary he's made for Amazon TV, Amazon Video, called Earth Cycle. And then the last episode was with Marcus Stitz, the Edinburgh-based German cyclist who had been back to Germany last summer to cycle down the Iron Curtain Trail through Germany, and that was an interesting listen. So thank you to all those people who have taken the time to speak to me and made the podcast what it is over the course of the last 12 months. Which brings us to this episode of the podcast, episode number 30. Now, cycle touring is usually undertaken on a bicycle where you've got two wheels and they're both the same size, you've got one saddle and one cyclist. But that's not always the case. And in this episode of the podcast, we're going to chat to three people, Rachel Marsden, Catherine Dixon, and then later in the podcast, Joff Summerfield. They all did it in a slightly different way. Catherine and Rachel collectively are Tandem WOW. I think the WOW stands for Women on Wheels. And they cycled around the world in record-breaking time on a tandem. Joff Summerfield spent quite a long time, a few years, cycling around the world on a penny-farthing. We're going to speak to Joff a bit later in the podcast, but we're going to start with the Tandem WOW duo of Rachel Marsden and Catherine Dixon. And I started by asking them to introduce themselves.
I'm Cat Dixon. When I'm not cycling, I am a solicitor. I run an organisation called the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and yeah, that's me.
So I'm Raz. When I'm not cycling, I work as a nurse consultant looking after people living with motor neuron disease.
Raz, you're in Oxford, and Kat, you're in York. And we're going to talk about the world record where you cycled around the world on a tandem. How did it actually come about to begin with? Because you don't live near each other. So how did you meet, and how did you first come up with the idea of cycling around the world on a tandem?
So we met cycling. So we were doing a charity ride between London and Paris for motor neuron disease. And we started cycling together. We started doing, I guess, ever more challenging events. And I'd always had an ambition to ride around the world. And we were chatting. I think we were either doing the Étape or doing something silly, and said, wouldn't it be great to do that together, and wouldn't it be fantastic to do it on a tandem, and why don't we try and break the world record?
So Raz, when you heard that, when Kat said that to you, did you immediately say, yeah, brilliant idea, I'm signed up?
Yeah, I did. I tend to agree with things and then think about them after. When we first met, she talked about her cycling around the world, and I used to think, oh, wow, that's amazing. And then when it was, how about you? I just said, yes, yeah, we'll do that.
Did you ever consider just doing it on two ordinary bicycles rather than a tandem?
Well, I guess the challenge of doing the record, I guess, was something that it emerged through the conversation, and the event just became a tandem event and going for the world record. I don't really recall us thinking about doing it on solos. It was more, it sort of soon morphed into oh, well, why don't we, wouldn't it be fun to do it on a tandem? I mean, I'd ridden a tandem before, but the tandem riding was new to Raz, so it was a whole new experience.
So Raz, it sounds as though you were convinced fairly quickly, but what was the reaction of people that you knew, your friends, your family, when you told them, oh, I'm going to take 12 months off work and cycle around the world on a tandem?
Well, I think I tend to do things in a seepage slow sort of way. So I didn't announce that we were going to do that, but started saying, I'm just chatting, I'm just thinking about this, and letting people acclimatize to the thought, and then get it in their psyche, and then it becomes, that's what's going to happen. So I think it was a slow process of telling people. I think we both had to Kat had to give up her job, and I was fortunate. I work in the NHS, and I got a career break because I worked there for a long time. So it was easier for me in some ways. Kat had to, commit a lot. And that was the point of, you can chat about things, you can dream about things, and, have fun thoughts and what if. But the day I spoke to Kat and she's packing up her office, I thought, this is the point of no return. This is when we're actually going to really, really do it, because I can't have Kat giving up a job and then me going, oh, actually, Kat, maybe not. So, that was the point where there's no turning back.
I hope you don't mind me saying, but you're both in your early mid-50s. You don't associate people going off on long record-breaking cycles who are in their 50s. They tend to be in their 20s, in their 30s, pushing it perhaps in their 40s, but in their 50s. Was that an issue?
There's a point where doing a world record would physically, from an age perspective, be too much of a challenge. So I guess we were pretty fit, we're in pretty good shape. In spite of the fact that we're in our 50s, we felt that we could set the record. And we're very fortunate that we are as fit. That said, we work pretty hard at keeping that and maintaining that level of fitness. So I think, I don't want to say that, oh, well, you're never too old or anything like that. But we felt that the time was right, and we felt that we were fit enough, and we felt that we were capable enough of doing it. And if you feel like that, then I guess irrespective of what age you are, you can go for it. I mean, I wouldn't expect to be doing it sort of in my 90s, but, never say never.
The great thing about being in your 50s, I mean, I actually quite love it, because for me, the children have grown up. They're kind of independent people. They're just doing fantastically, and they're not at home all the time. So that's great. Even more excuse to go for a cycle ride.
So specifically, Raz, what was the reaction of your children when you told them that you were going to do this?
They were 100% excited. They were, as I say, I kind of tend to talk about things in an abstract way. So initially, I let the penny drop. But when they really realized it was happening, they were just excited, 100% supportive. And I don't know if they were surprised. They were quite proud, I think.
There was a third party in this endeavour, and that was obviously Alice. Alice being the name that you chose for your tandem. Did you get your bike from that place up in North Yorkshire, Kat?
Yeah, so JD Tandems up in Gargrave, Ruth and John and Jamie, fantastic team. So Alice is bespoke, so we had Alice made for this journey. There's quite a few things that you need to think about, I guess, if you're going to put your bike through that amount of, I suppose, pressure and stress. So they were brilliant in terms of getting the spec together. We worked with them and, had Alice built. So Alice is steel. She's got coupling, so you can take it to bits into two parts because, when you fly. And we were also sort of mindful of having very strong wheels. So the wheels have got 48 spokes. And so it's quite heavy, but really robust. And she did very well.
Now, you set off in June, the end of June 2019, and that is an important factor because when you arrived back, it was on the cusp of all the COVID situation earlier in 2020, and perhaps we'll mention that in a bit. But could you describe the route that you took around the world?
So we set off from Oxford, went across France to Riviera in Italy, and then we went down the Croatian coast. We went through Slovenia, Bosnia, back into Croatia, and then we went into Montenegro, Albania, Macedonia, then over the border into Greece, and then through Greece into Turkey up to Istanbul. And that was the sort of the European bit finished. And then we crossed the Bosphorus and then carried on through Turkey, following the Black Sea, through lots of scary tunnels and into Georgia, where we finished in Tbilisi. And then we got our first flight. So we flew from Tbilisi to Mumbai in India, and we rode around the coast of India to Calcutta. Then we went over the border into Myanmar, and we rode from sort of Mandalay down into Thailand, then through Thailand into Malaysia, and then to Singapore. And then we got a flight to Australia, and we crossed the whole of Australia from Perth to Brisbane. And then we flew to New Zealand, from the South Island to the North Island, then to the States from San Francisco to Miami, and then a flight back to Morocco. So from Casablanca up through Spain, back through France, back into this country and back to Oxford. And that was a journey, 18,263 miles in total.
So in terms of the flights that you had to take, and obviously when you're cycling around the world, not that I've ever done it, but when you are cycling around the world, you've got to fly over the oceans, obviously. But what are the rules regarding flying? For example, you said you flew from Georgia to India. Obviously, I can understand why you did that, bearing in mind what's underneath if you fly over. But What are the rules regarding that?
First of all, you can't take any private transport. You can't charter a plane or anything for speed. It has to be the same bike. So we took Alice apart with the couplings. So each country we went to when we were flying, we cleaned her very well. And then we boxed her up in two bike boxes, and flew. So the rules are for Guinness going in the same direction all the time. So you can go east to west or west to east, but any miles you go back on yourself don't count. So it's always in one direction, and a minimum of 18,000 miles.
And you've got to cross two Antipodean points. So in other words, you've got to be at the other side of the world, and you have to plot them in your route. So ours were Auckland and Gibraltar. You've got to properly circumnavigate it, and you've got to record when you're at opposite sides of the world at some point.
And is it quite an onerous task in terms of actually making sure that you've got all the documentation to prove it to Guinness records that you did actually do the whole thing?
Well, most records that Guinness kind of take part in are either an hour or a day, but very few last quite as long. And the information and the evidence they need is the same, really. So we kept diaries, we had blogs, we had Strava, we had Wahoo, we had logs of every place we stayed. We had evidence and stamps for everywhere. We had photographs, we had videos. So that had to all be collated for every day.
Now, getting to the cycling itself, as you said, you set off in the summer of 2019. Had you managed to get in much practice before setting off on the Tandem itself?
I mean, it's very difficult to train for that length because obviously, you know, if you actually do that length of journey, you've actually already done it. But we were doing sort of back-to-back days on the Tandem, you know, carrying weight, because obviously the record is unsupported, which means that you have to carry all your own stuff, which means that the bike's pretty heavy because you've got camping gear and all your gear and everything with you. So we practiced that. You know, we were doing some journeys between Oxford and Yorkshire, and we went overseas as well to do some difficult stuff in the mountains. Climbing on a tandem's pretty hard. Anybody who's been on a tandem will know that it's much more challenging taking a tandem up a hill than it probably is a solo. We trained pretty hard on it, but we also trained on our solos as well. So, you know, I mean, a lot of it was just getting miles in and things.
Whenever I see anybody on a tandem, it's usually, not always, but I think probably, 95% of the time, it looks like a married couple, a man and a woman, and it is always, and this is 100%, I've never ever seen the woman on the front. And I always find it a curious thing. I'm not sure whether it's a man thing that they're determined to be in control and they've got to be on the front, or whether it's because they tend to be the bigger person, but that can't always be the case. Now, obviously, you're in a different situation because you're two women. How do you decide, or how did you decide who goes where on the bike? And also, did you swap around occasionally?
We didn't swap around. The bike set up, you know, it's quite micro-adjusted really in terms of, you know, the fit for us both. We are more or less the same height. Even so, it is set up individually. And that was the combination that worked. Tandem riding, you know, particularly doing what we were doing, it's a real team effort. And that worked for us. I know that some people do swap around, but we didn't. And that seemed to work well. We've both got our jobs to do. And, you know, we kind of got on with them.
For the uninitiated like me, how do you decide? How do you decide who goes on the back and who goes on the front? Raz?
I think it probably wasn't a decision we had to kind of formally make. I think Kat is very much more experienced in riding a tandem than me. She really doesn't like the back. I think the way we work it worked perfectly well because you have to be very intuitive and I have to know when Kat's changing gear. I have to know what she's going to be doing because, you know, changing weight, changing gear and keeping things going, I was just fine on the back. And also, as Kat mentioned, the micro adjustments. When we first set off down through France, I didn't have to be cycling too long and the soles of my feet burnt, you know, really that burny sensation. And they were so painful just because I was pressing on the nerves and my feet. And I just couldn't kind of fix it for a while. And then we just slightly, only kind of millimeters, adjusted the cleat, immediately sorted. And therefore, that was just perfect. And I didn't, neither of us wanted to have to change everything each time we changed place. So it worked really well, actually.
So what controls do you have on the back? What actually do you have access to?
Pedals. I have a brake, but I never use the brake. Cat doesn't brake. I didn't brake. I have access to all the food. I navigate and do the talking and explaining where to go. And I also had, one of the things we did have, which was brilliant, and we used all the time, was a little speaker that we could play books or music or things like that. And I had control of that and what we played. So Kat was, as the pilot, but as the stoker, I've got 2 free hands. So I did the videoing and the photographs and all the things I can do no-handed.
So you're kind of the DJ.
Yeah.
The navigation's quite important as well. So, I mean, if you imagine we could get up to like 50 miles an hour going down a hill, fully laden. When you're doing that as a pilot, you've got to be concentrating on the road. And Raz will be watching the Wahoo, looking for bends on the roads, and she'll be, saying, right, it's steep bend to the right or whatever. It's quite a team effort in terms of how you ride on a tandem. You've got to have a sort of a cadence. Obviously, you're going at the same cadence. You're changing up and you're changing down. You've got to sort of have that rhythm right. And we obviously practice that, and we're pretty good at it.
Including our own kind of terminology. If I described a bend, if it's a sharp bend, or if it's a curly bend, or a curvy bend, or a bend to the right, the left, I don't know how I described them, but Kat knew what was coming up. Hopefully,
it sounds a bit similar to when you see rally drivers, where you've got the co-driver.
Yes, it's very similar to that. Yeah.
Were there any moments where there was tension between you because of the different roles that you had on the bike?
No. Not in the different role element. I think there was not tension between us. I think there was times when, just being with somebody 24/7, we react to things differently, but being tired, being hungry. So we're never angry at each other, but more just like a grump of some description that needed feeding, really, mostly. And some sleep. And then it was fixed. So I think it was an understanding. I don't think we ever really fell out actually with each other. It was more a circumstance or something else going on.
Yeah. I mean, you get pretty tired and hungry, and sort of managing the food, particularly in some countries where the sort of food that's available is not what you would generally be using to fuel a cycling trip, sort of curries 3 times a day or whatever else it may be, depending on where you are. There was times, obviously, when we were pretty tired, but actually we looked after each other. So I would know if Raz was hungry and actually needed feeding, even if Raz didn't or denied that she was. And it was the same with me, that she would know that we needed to take a break, or we needed some food, and we just look after each other because we were so in tune with each other. Really, it just became a sort of a natural thing. We just know. I've probably never known anybody so intuitively in that way, and that's kind of developed as obviously as we went along.
It's interesting that you mentioned lack of sleep sometimes, because I was going to ask you about accommodation and the extent to which the route was planned. Did you have in your mind, or did you have a detailed plan as to where you were going to be each night? Did you have accommodation booked, or was it all worked out en route?
So the way we would do it is that we'd set the route for the day. So we'd say, right, because we were riding between 80 and 100 miles a day, generally speaking. There was occasionally we would go over that. I think the longest day we did was just over 120. And we would say, right, where's the next place that we're going to be able to get some accommodation, we're going to be able to eat, that is a minimum of 80 miles away. So if it was 95, it was 95, and that's what we'd be riding. We'd set the route to that place. And when we got to that place, we would find somewhere to stay. And depending on where we were in the world, it could be camping. So we pretty much camped across Europe. In India and Southeast Asia, it would have been impossible to camp because everybody would have been in your tent and it just wouldn't have happened. And it was monsoon as well, so that didn't help. So we were staying in some grotty hostels and hotels, but that's how we did it. We knew where we were going, but not exactly where we'd be every night.
So we're just one day ahead of ourselves in planning, really.
When you see a tandem in Britain, people always look and stare. And that's in Britain, where I would have thought, I don't know, I haven't got a clue how many tandems there are in Britain, but there are probably quite a few, and you do occasionally see them. I would imagine you went to some countries where you never see a tandem, and you must have had some interesting reactions from the people who you passed and the people who you met and the people who you talked to.
Yes, completely. I think wherever we went, people were incredibly intrigued. They beat the horn, they waved, they smiled, they laughed a lot. Particularly in India, they were very interested in the tandem, interested in us. And I suppose, women riding a tandem, you don't see that very often. And I think, yeah, there was a lot of interest. We were asked to have selfies a lot in India. People riding up beside us on their bikes, on their motorbikes or their cars, following us for 5 or 10 miles and just, constantly asking for us. We just didn't stop, because had we stopped, we would never have got anywhere, because 20 to 25 people each day asking for selfies or for us to stop on a corner of the road for a photograph or this. We just kind of smiled and waved and carried on cycling, really. We didn't have time to stop.
Is that quite frustrating that you didn't have time to stop sometimes? Did you want to sometimes think, I'd really like to just sit on the bank of this river and watch the kind of the sunset? Or was the pressure of time something that obviously it kept you going, it kept you probably motivated, but in terms of actually the enjoyment of the trip itself, did it have a negative effect?
I don't think so, because it's a mindset issue, isn't it? We'd set out with the view to set the world record. And actually, we had lots of opportunities to see the world go by, see the countries we were traveling through in a really privileged way, which is on a bike. And so, obviously we did stop for coffee, and, there was always a sort of a bit of a drive to kind of have a cup of coffee or whatever. But we had very, very few days off. There was very few days when we didn't ride the bike. And generally, in fact, I think pretty much every time it was for a reason. Either we were getting ready for a flight, or it was a mechanical and we were sorting the bike out. So had it been another trip where we would have, taken our time to go around the world and we were going to tourist destinations, and it would have been a different trip. That wasn't what we'd set out to do, and therefore it didn't ever feature for me that there wasn't a day when we didn't want to get on the bike and ride.
No, not at all. And I think, those amazing visions that you say you'd stop and look at, we were cycling and looking at them. We looked at that and we experienced that. We met somebody who was cycling, and he'd been cycling for 4 years. And that's a different way of traveling, and lovely. And I'd like to do that. I'd like to do it in a different way, but I loved doing it the way we did it. And I think what was different is when we were talking to Jenny Graham, and she did a solo, she never stopped, just never seemed to stop, day or night, constantly. And there were times when I went to hear her speak in Bristol before we left, and she talked about a family kind of giving her food, and she ate, but then wanted to go, but then they wanted to kind of chat and hang around. And because we were doing set miles each day, if it took us a little bit longer that day and we arrived a little bit later, that's fine, because we'd achieved every day, we achieved exactly what we set out to do. So whether we did stop and talk to somebody for half an hour, that was fine. We'd just arrive half an hour later, but we didn't lose a day or anything like that. So it was, we were fortunate, and it's a different style to Jenny Graham, non-stop. We were non-stop, but we set a goal and we achieved it every day.
So we knew what the record was, so we knew what we needed to do, and that's what we did. It was very focused in that respect, for sure.
Yeah, one of the beauties of being on a bike is the fact that you can appreciate everything that's around you, even if you are cycling against the clock. You touched upon mechanicals there with Alice. Any big problems that you were a real challenge to repair?
We had small kind of things that were fixable, inner tubes, that kind of thing. We never had problems with the wheels, which Lewis and Lloyd, that's one thing, reading their blog, their spokes were breaking, they weren't fixing them, their wheels ended up looking like a banana, and they had real ongoing problems with their wheels, but we were given such good advice.
Just to clarify, when you refer to Louis and Lloyd, That's Lloyd Collier and Louis Snellgrove, and they're the people who broke the record previous to you.
Yeah.
They did it in 281 days. So you did actually get some advice from them.
It was just reading their blog and seeing the amount of trouble that they had with their wheels. And then when we talked to John and Ruth and Jamie, they just built the wheels by hand with 48 spokes. We never had any problems with those. They didn't buckle, bend, not a single spoke broke on the wheels. And, that's quite an achievement to get with all the weight, with us on the bike and the water, fully laden going along across the Nullarbor. We kind of guesstimated 200 kilos with us all. And the wheels were great and they were fine. But Kat will tell you, we did have a major mechanical, the furthest point in the middle of nowhere that we could possibly have, which took us a while to fix.
The worst mechanical we had was just out of Perth. So we were about 4 or 5 days out of Perth, approaching the main bit of the Nullarbor Desert, which is the desert between Perth and Adelaide in Australia, where you're going for miles between roadhouses, and that's it. There's very few people who actually live in this desert. And we had a problem with our timing train, which is the train that connects the pilot and the stoker, and it kept falling off. And the mechanism that tightened it had seized. It probably got some sand and grit in it, and we could not shift it. We did all sorts of things to shift it. And the train wheel was also damaged. And we weren't carrying a big file with us, so we ended up sort of trying to file some of this damage down with a nail file, and goodness knows. And it took us about 7 hours. So I think 4 hours one afternoon to try and fix it. And then we thought we'd got it to a point where it was rideable, and set off in the morning. And because we'd had to wild camp that night because we're in the middle of nowhere, and it wasn't right. It fell off again. And so it took us about another 3 hours. This was in 40-degree heat. The temperatures there went up to about 45 degrees. So it was absolutely covered in flies. Sitting at the side of the road in all this dust and sand, which was just getting in everything, trying to fix this mechanical. And I think the difficulty with it was that if we couldn't have fixed it, we'd have had to have gone back to Perth. And obviously that would have lost us a lot of time. And the next bike shop en route was 1,700 miles away, because the distance between Perth and Adelaide is 1,700 miles. So we needed to either sort it or go back. And fortunately, we managed to fix it, and we got to Adelaide and then, got it fixed properly.
And that wasn't the only issue in Australia, was it? Because you also had problems with the fires, is that right?
As we were cycling, there were fires. I don't know if you remember the massive fires in Sydney and around there. The smoke from Sydney affected some friends of ours that we stopped with actually in New Zealand, and they suffered from the smoke from those fires. They were so colossal that we had to change the route to avoid them. There's the fires, there's the drought, there was the weather. That was really just harsh, basic. It was just extraordinary what the Australians were kind of having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We were cycling through it, but as observers as much as anything, not living with the drought, because we had to avoid the coast, the Gold Coast. We cycled more inland where they'd had no rain for 3 years. And there was just dust. The cows, you could see their ribs, and they could only be fed every other day because there was really harsh conditions, and they literally had no water.
And you said that climate change more general was an issue that you came up with on several occasions, yeah?
I think India, we knew that we were going to catch the tail on of the monsoon as we went sort of into India and then through into Southeast Asia. But actually the monsoon rains were extended that year. So we got very, very wet most days, particularly in the afternoon. And that was one of the reasons why Australia wasn't getting the rain, because it was actually sort of falling in Asia and Southeast Asia and wasn't getting across into Australia. So we went, we're absolutely drenched, which was a real challenge actually because of saddle sore. So, you literally couldn't keep dry. We were riding in plastic bags to try and keep the worst of it off. But it was like somebody literally tipping a bucket of water over you every afternoon. We got really, really bad saddle sores.
But the upside of that is we are now experts at saddle sores, and we know exactly what to do and how to treat those. Yeah.
So after all these trials and tribulations, the monsoon, the fires, the breakages in Australia, you've crossed America and you're back in Europe, and you must be thinking in the back of your minds, well, this is all going to be plain sailing now. All we need to do is cycle our way through Europe. But of course, you arrived back in Europe just at the time when the COVID pandemic was starting. Now, when did you first hear the word COVID or the coronavirus mentioned? When did you think it was going to be an issue?
I think we were aware of it in America. We'd heard, but I think the beauty of cycling is you can ignore a certain amount. We saw the news, we saw the headlines, we could escape the Brexit discussions, and COVID was becoming more of a discussion. And on my WhatsApp, my village WhatsApp, they were all talking about it, and I felt a long way away from it all, really. But we were aware of it, but certainly no idea of the impact. Really no. But then I suppose nobody did at the time.
I mean, initially we were thinking, probably like everybody else, oh God, it sounds like a really bad kind of flu breakout. And I think we started to get concerned about it when we were in Spain. So we travelled up through Morocco, we got into Spain, and we started to realise that it was actually quite serious. I mean, fortunately, we were quite ahead of our schedule. So our schedule was really to cycle faster than 281 days, which was the current record. But fortunately, we were way over 2 weeks sort of ahead at this point. And we were in Madrid. And had we been in Madrid on our original schedule, we probably wouldn't have got out of Spain, because they locked down. I think it was slightly before we did, and I think it was slightly before France as well. It was around the same time as France, but we would have they banned cycling, so we wouldn't have been able to get out of Spain. And we thought, actually, do you know what? We're going to have to sort of motor in and get back, because everything was closing. So the cafes were closing, the restaurants, so we couldn't get any food or very little food during the day. They were starting to shut the places to stay. And we thought we need to get out of France. And as it turned out, we got out of France actually on the day that Macron put the travel ban in place, which would have stopped us riding, because you weren't allowed to exercise together, and got on the second to last passenger ferry out of France. So it was really touch and go. So that feeling of, oh, we've broken the record. We had this thing, almost putting us under pressure, to get back. And there was this doubt as to, to whether we would, even though we'd done the 18,000 miles by this point. So we'd done the requisite mileage. We still had to get back to Oxford.
Had you broken the record by the time you got back, or did you have to get back to the place that you originally started from?
That was another of the stipulations. You had to cross the same line. So we couldn't have finished the record until we crossed the pink line in Cowley, where we started. Yeah.
It's an amazing achievement. 263 days, 8 hours and 7 minutes. And you smashed the record. You just said it was 281 days by the previous people, the previous year. But I would imagine, bearing in mind your comments about Jenny Graham, I would imagine there's probably scope for somebody to come along and break your record in the future if they really are intent on having a very different mindset and just going every day, cycle. So what advice would you give to anybody who did want to attempt to break your record?
Absolutely, go for it. And don't look back, and really good luck. And I think, as you say, there is a lot of scope. And I remember John and George, when they first did it, they were the first men to do that. And they said, we've had fun setting this record, it's there to be broken. And Lewis and Lloyd went to break that, and we broke that. So, somebody will be just lining up. They can't do it just yet, because it's not going to be quite so easy, but I think there definitely will be. Yeah, if they did it Jenny Graham style, then there'll be no stopping them, and it would be very, very different. However, I think there is a balance. There's breaking the world record, but there is actually having a fantastic experience at the same time. And I think, I have to say, even on reflection, I think we got the balance right. We did it and enjoyed every single minute of it. And I think, there were times we weren't scared. People were fantastic. And so, I think the balance for us, and doing that, we achieved everything and more than we set out to do. Had we cycled through the night, yeah, that would be fine, but I'd be really tired. Kat would have had to put up with me. I'd be incredibly grumpy and tired and just couldn't cycle. And we got the balance right because we felt good, we were well, our health was good, and we did both, really. Had fun and the record.
We set out to break the record. We were very focused in doing that. We had a schedule, and that's what we did. Don't get us wrong, it's not a walk in the park. We're riding, all day, every day. We did ride into the evenings, but what we didn't do is we didn't ride overnight. Records are there to be broken, aren't they? I mean, you set a record so that somebody's got something to aim for and something to target, and that's what it's about. That's how we move on. That's how mankind, if you like, personkind continues. And I think that's what it's for. We did it in such a way that it was challenging physically and mentally, but we also had as Raz says, a fantastic experience of seeing every country. There's a highlight in every country, and every day that we got on the bike was a new adventure. We didn't know who we were going to see and who we were going to meet and where we were going to be, and it was fabulous.
And obviously, if somebody does come along and break your record, then you can do like Mark Beaumont and just do it all over again at some point in the future.
Sure.
Yeah, we can do that.
I mean, Mark's 80, was obviously, it was an amazing achievement. He was supported, so it was a different sort of a record to the one that we did. And and I guess we purposefully picked a route that was hopefully quite an interesting route. There are probably faster routes that you could do, because if you're not flying, when you fly, you are actually losing some time. We looked at the world and we thought, well, actually, there's some places that it would be fantastic to cycle through, and we tried to build those into the route, as opposed to, I think if you read Jenny's story, she was actually pretty scared when she was cycling through Russia and things, and had to travel at night because it was such a scary experience. So we tried to avoid some of that, and I think the route that we set was pretty nice, really.
Well, perhaps, Raz, you could get your children to get in a camper van and follow you around, and you could just do it without the panniers.
Well, they did offer. They did offer when my son's a kind of sports therapist, and he thought that we would definitely need a masseur on the way around. That would have been fun, but yeah, and they just watched from their armchairs. But yeah, next time maybe.
Perhaps the idea of going around the world is not on the list yet. But do you have any more tandem plans together in the future once the whole pandemic thing is a thing of the past?
Yeah, I mean, very soon we hope to get Alice new wheels, racing wheels, and in the very near future, we're hoping to do the Chase the Sun from dawn to dusk across the country. That's June, so hopefully that will still all happen, and that will be that's 200 miles in the day. So I'm actually really looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to getting back on Alice and riding that.
I've never heard of that before, the Chase the Sun.
Yeah.
It's the longest day of the year, and you cross the country. Can you choose
a very thin bit?
Well, there is a southern route, and then there's a northern one we're doing from Falmouth to Prestwick across the country. It's 200 miles. We did look into it, but we just didn't think we could do it this time in Italy. It'd be nice and sunny and warm, but we're going to do it in the UK very soon. So really looking forward to that.
In terms of planning anything at the moment, it's actually quite a challenge, really, in the sense that you don't quite know where you're going to be able to go and what you're going to be able to do. So we've been training. We're looking forward to getting back on Alice, and that Alice. The first ride out on Alice will be 200 odd miles, so that'll do for starters.
That's a warmer upper.
Yeah, that'll warm us up for sure.
So that was two people on a tandem. Now we're back to one person, but not on a traditional bicycle. Joff Summerfield is, well, one of the few penny-farthing cyclists. And he's also cycled around the world. And a few days ago, I chatted with Joff about his cycles, both in Britain and around the world, on his beloved penny-farthing.
Hello, my name's Joff Summerfield. I live down in the countryside of Kent and I build penny-farthing bicycles. I'm a long-distance penny-farthing rider, having cycled around the world one direction and cycled about halfway around the world in the other direction, and they're most certainly my passion in life.
Now, I actually posted something to Twitter earlier this week saying that the Tandem cyclist that we've just heard and you were going to be on the podcast, and I made that probably much repeated mistake of mixing up a penny-farthing cyclist with a unicyclist. Now, a unicyclist by definition is somebody with one wheel. You have not got one wheel on your penny-farthing. Can you define what a penny-farthing actually is?
Yes, essentially, to me, you have obviously the huge front wheel and then you have a nice small rear wheel which stops you sort of falling off and kind of keep your balance and everything. There's no rules or anything, but essentially it's fixed wheel, so there's no gears, solid tyres, so no air in the tyres. You sit up nice and high, and that's it. A very, very simple machine. And that's the essence of the bikes. They're a simple machine. They look beautiful, and the comparison of a unicycle, it does happen a lot. And people, if they're driving down the road, they see you up ahead, and they stop and have a chat. Normally, they will always say, "I thought you were riding a unicycle to start with," and then it looked a bit odd and couldn't quite figure it out, and then saw, it was a penny-farthing. And oddly, people tend to know when they see it. Doesn't matter where you are, they always know the name penny-farthing, which is kind of quite a strange thing and the good sign of education around the world.
Did they precede the standard bicycle that we know today as a bicycle?
It's a weird thing. They're actually an evolution. So the first bicycles were the old wooden hobby horses where the dandies would scoot along. They would have iron shod wheels, so obviously no tyres at all, just literally on irons, same as carts. And then they wanted to go faster, as we all do at some stage, so they put cranks on the front wheel so they could pedal. But of course they had no gearing, no chains really then, so the only way they could go faster was to make the front wheel bigger. So the front wheels gradually got bigger. Then they did away with the iron shod wheels and put like a solid rubber wheel or tyre on there, and they got bigger and bigger because they wanted to go faster, and that's how they evolved. It's purely an evolution. But pennies were only really at their peak for about 10 years, and then the modern Rover safety bike, so named because they're a lot safer than penny-farthings, came out, and pretty much, and as well at the same time pneumatic tyres came out as well, so that was the real death knell. Although there were a few pennies at the end of the period that did have pneumatic tyres, they were done then, and they disappeared, and the modern safety bike came to the fore.
Now, you mentioned before that you do actually have solid tyres. Why do you not have pneumatic tyres?
I could have a pneumatic on the back, on the small wheel, because they would be available, but no one's making pneumatic tyres for the front as well. And yeah, although, like I mentioned before, they did have them at the end of the period. Again, the essence of these bikes is simplicity. They're just so simple, and having a solid tyre is very, very simple. It's not very comfortable, I've got to say that, but you don't get any punctures, and that would be the other problem. If you had a puncture on your front tyre on a penny, it's always, whatever happens, it's always a big accident. So you would want to avoid that, and yeah, the essence of them is simplicity, and solid tyres are the way to go, and you get used to it. You don't have to carry a pump. There you go, no patches. It's just very simple.
Yeah, it was a bit of a daft question actually. Yeah, of course, those size tyres are not manufactured, obviously. Is there a minimum dimension or a maximum dimension of that front wheel that it has to be in order to be classed as a penny-farthing?
No, it's more a minimum, I would say. I mean, if it's less than, say, 40 inches, then it's becoming into more of a fun bike. I mean, there's a bike called a Coca, I think it is, which is a 36-inch kind of big mountain bike, and that is a pneumatic tyre, which is a modern sort of Chinese brand thing. It's a fun thing, but it's quite an ugly looking thing. Once they get up to sort of the high 40s, it all depends on what you want to do with it and how long your legs are. So if you haven't, I'm 5'9", I could probably just about ride a 56. But my touring bike is like a 49-inch because I want to get up some hills, and that's the only way. The only gearing you've got is the size of your front wheel and the length of your cranks. So that's what I ride for touring on. I've got a race penny, and that's a bigger wheel because I want to go faster then, and very, very short cranks. So it just depends what you want to do. And if you've got long legs, you can ride right up to 58 if you want to, but you're never going to be getting up any hills. So that's more of a flat area bike. If there's any hills where you live, you wouldn't be riding it.
And you actually make your own penny-farthing, don't you?
Yes, I do make my own bikes. Yes. So the first one I made, I rode that to Paris for the Millennium celebrations, and then learnt an awful lot about making bikes. I over-engineered it, and it weighed with the bike and with the kit that I took just for a 5-day trip to Paris. It was 120 pounds in weight, I think it was. It was just ridiculous. So then I made a second one and rode Land's End to John O'Groats on that one, and again learnt an awful lot about pennies and how to travel with them. And it wasn't long after that someone asked me to make them one, because I had the website up, and so I made them one, and then it went on from there. So you've got to test your product, and that's my thing. You've got to make sure they're gonna be strong.
Now, you were inspired by a chap called Thomas Stevens. He cycled around the world. Can you tell me a bit about him and what he did and why he was so inspirational?
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Stevens is the hero of most penny-farthing riders. I won't say everyone, but yeah, I mean, he set off in 1884, and he started in San Francisco. Though he was English, he cycled across the States, so he was the first person ever to cycle across the States. Then from Boston, I believe, he went to Liverpool, took a boat to Liverpool, and carried on through UK, through Europe, ended up in Tehran, wintered in Tehran, then carried on, and we were at war with Russia at the time, so he couldn't go up through Russia, so he took then a boat round to India, and across India, and then he took a boat to get onto, I think in Macau he landed, and up through China, then Japan, and then back to the States. And so his trip was between 1884 and 1887. And he wrote a book about it, which is, it's a tome, but it's of its time and a fascinating read. When I set out on my trip, you can't possibly recreate his journey, and I never intended to, and I didn't follow his route at all, because you've got to make it your own journey. You can't say you've ridden the route that Thomas Stevens wrote, because it's over 100 years later, and he was probably 99% of the time wasn't riding on tarmac, so you can't compare the trips. I mean, he's the hero. He's the first person ever to do it, and he stands out. The interesting thing, he's actually buried in North Finchley graveyard in London. And when I left on my trip, I went to his graveside and took a little stone with me from his grave and carried it with me all the way around. And when I came back, I went back to his grave and put it back. So in a small way, he's been round twice.
Yeah, that's quite nice. You obviously set off yourself to cycle around the world. Cycling around the world nowadays is not uncommon. Lots of people do it. It's still quite an adventure. Going and doing it on a penny-farthing is kind of an extra step. I wouldn't have thought it's the most comfortable way of doing it. Is it stable? Is it an appropriate thing to be riding on rough roads that you might find in some less developed countries? How difficult is it to actually cycle a penny-farthing in quite difficult rough conditions?
Well, it's a good question, and people quite often ask that, what about, you obviously can't go on any dirt roads, but you've got to have to remember, in the period, that's all there was. If it's compact and it's solid, then you can ride it on the ground, even on quite bumpy and rough roads. The only thing you can't ride it on is sand. Sand, you're having an accident. But the further afield you get away, I mean, I went down through China and then went out into Tibet. So I rode the length of the Himalaya. And I can ride with all the bags and everything on. I can do about a 6% grade if it's smooth surface and it's at sea level. Once you get to any altitude, then obviously that goes right down, and you just have to get off and push. And I think the longest I spent was 3 days pushing it up a mountain. But you can do it. I'm not fast. I can do roughly 40 miles a day. That's what I can do, and I can do that day after day. The girls on the Tandem, I mean, I think it's 120 miles a day that they were doing, and obviously that's for a record which I certainly wasn't trying to set. That's something I could never do. I think my longest day was 92 miles, and that was riding into Toronto because I know there was a beer and family waiting for me there to see them. But that I was in bits by the end of that, and by that time I was super fit as well. That's probably 2 years into the trip. But it is impractical, it is uncomfortable, but it opens so many doors for you. You get such great fun reactions. Even people just laughing, lying on their backs laughing with their legs in the air. It's still good. It's all positive. So that's a real positive thing about doing it. It is slightly mad, but that's okay. I'll take that on the chin.
Was it your intention to cycle around the world, or was it planned? Did you have a route kind of set, or did you just make it up as you went along?
Oh, pretty much made it up, yeah. So I left on the 1st of May 2006 and got back in November 2008. I knew I was heading east, 40 miles a day. You can only guess what's going to happen. Things happen in the world, you just don't know what's going to happen. So, I don't like to make too many plans. I just had maps with me, I didn't have a phone or anything. And just follow, keep the wind on your back as much as you can, try and find a river to follow, because that's easier. Yeah, and just wing it really, and do it as you go along. I mean, I personally found I knew I was going to be away for 2 to 3 years, but trying to look ahead and look at it as a big picture, it's just overwhelming. And so you just kind of think, a few days ahead or a week ahead, just roughly heading east, so you know roughly where you're going to head for. So I was kind of roughly heading for Istanbul to go through there, and just see what happens. Because if people say, "Oh, you should go and see this mountain, go and see this amazing mosque or something," well, I want to go and see it, And if it's off my route, well, that's fine. It's off my route. I don't care, and I'd much rather do that and just wing it as I go along, and I find that much more sort of stress free. Very little planning. I watch all the stuff on the TV, the documentaries where they're going on expeditions and they have the crew and everything, the support, and I'm like, God, it's the wages of one of your support crew would have paid for my whole trip, So it's definitely a different way of travelling.
If you're on I hate to use the expression a normal bike, but whenever I say normal, put it in inverted commas. But when you're on a normal bike, you can, even if it's quite windy, you can kind of grind along, and your centre of gravity is relatively low, so you're probably not going to fall off. It would take a considerable gust of wind to actually blow you off your bike. On a penny-farthing, your centre of gravity is quite high, I would imagine, and the ability of the wind, even a relatively light wind to knock you off your bike, is quite good, I would have thought. Is that correct?
Spot on, absolutely spot on. I mean, obviously the headwind that all cyclists hate, I've got the aerodynamics of a house brick, so you really catch the wind. Crosswinds are the bad ones because what they do, they catch the rim, the wind catches the rim of the bike, and it will steer you as well. So you can lean into it, but it will also steer you, which is dodgy. In Greece, I was going down like a valley, and it was a windy day, but very gusty, and there was a cross valley, and that caught me, and that blew me, and I tried to lead into it, and overcorrected, and I caught the pedals on the Armco on the side of the road and bounced off that, fell back into the road, and that had me off. And there was a lorry coming past, and his tyre just kissed my pith helmet, and you can still just about see the mark of the tyre on the side of a pith helmet. And the lorry stopped, and this chap jumped out, and he was like white as a sheet, and he was offering me to put the bike in the back, and it's like, no, it's fine, I wasn't a scratch on me. But you do have to be careful in crosswinds when it's gusting. I went up to Iceland, did a lap of Iceland in 2018, and there the wind was howling, and it honestly felt like I was riding at 45 degrees, although it was more constant wind then, which was I could kind of cope with, but that was probably the strongest wind, especially a crosswind, that I've ridden in there.
So the wearing of the pith helmet was probably not so much the look, but also to protect your head.
Yeah. Oh yes. Yeah. I mean, they're probably not that great as actual bike helmets originally, but what I've done with mine, I coated the inside with fiberglass, and with race car seats, the race car drivers are moulded to the seat, and you can use that same foam stuff, and I put that inside and moulded it to my head, so it's really, really comfortable now, and it's got sort of like a thick foam in there, and so it will actually do it. If I do fall off, it will actually protect my head. But when you come off them, it's normally you break your wrists first, then your elbows, then your teeth, and then you head. So it's the other things that break normally first than before you head on there. So because you're high up, maybe you've got a bit more time before you hit the ground. So just think about it.
Did you even bother trying to find an insurance company to insure you when you went around the world?
Yeah, I had medical insurance. Yeah, I mean bicycle touring insurance. Yeah, no, I had that. I didn't tell them I was on a penny farthing. I think it's madness not to have it, and it was. I can't remember how much I paid, but I got it for Iceland a couple of years ago again as well. And
but you didn't tell them you were on a penny farthing.
No, it had bike touring. Had bike touring on the policy, so that was the main thing. Yeah, it's a bike and I'm touring on it, so that counts. It's a bit like when you fly with a penny, so you make sure that they'll accept a bike, but you never tell them it's a penny farthing before you turn up at the airport, because they'll think it's the size of a house, and they'll probably just say no. So I always just get there really, really early and hang around, and if I can get it on the plane, possibly beforehand, then I will. And then you've got loads of time to negotiate and try and get the bike on the planes. But I don't want to give people extra stress by telling them all the information.
What was the most memorable bit of cycling around the world?
Well, I can say that in excitement wise or anticipation wise was probably Tibet, because by the time I'd got there, I'd gone down through China and Tibet was this, I read 7 years in Tibet, and it had a fascination. Obviously, the beauty of the country, the world, the mountains, the hardest to get into because I couldn't officially or legally at the time travel into Tibet without you needed an alien travel permit. And the visa that I had, the Chinese visa, covered me for going in there, but not the alien travel permit. They'd only give you one of those if you were flying in or going in on the train, because they didn't want independent travellers going there. So I had a great plan that I would just sneak through the border in the middle of the night, which is what I did. And then you have all checkpoints between sort of the border and Lhasa, and you can find out roughly where these are. And each and every one you have to do in the middle of the night and sneak through, get on. It's like going through Checkpoint Charlie. It's very exciting. And obviously with no lights on, but when there's no power down there, or there's no street lights or anything like that, because it's an unmade road. There's no tarmac there at all. And really exciting, and it sounds crazy, but it was it's very exciting. I think it was the Salween River. They had a checkpoint there, and I made the mistake of there's going to be a checkpoint at either side of the river, and I came up to the first one. I mean, it's pitch black, and you can't have any lights on because that would they would spot you then. And there was a guard with his gun fast asleep on the other side of the road, and I just trying to get a penny farthing under the barrier. Without making any noise. My heart was pounding, and I carried across. He didn't wake up, and I went across the bridge, and I was like, yay, I've got across. And then through the darkness and came to the other side and almost stepped on the toes of another guard there, again fast asleep, with his gun on his shoulder, and I could literally a foot away from me. And again, just you can literally hear your heart pounding, again trying to get the bike under the barrier and not make any noise at all, and creep off without waking him up. So that was the experience I had. I was a bit more careful after that on the checkpoints, but it's doable. Nothing's impossible. That's the thing. But Tibet was a stunning country, beautiful people. It's like stepping back in time for 300 years, and I would love to go back again one day. And anyone gets the chance, then I do recommend it as well.
I'm trying to imagine what the reaction would have been if any of those guards had found you in the middle of the night with no lights on, looking at a penny farthing, something that they'd probably never seen before in their life. I wonder what their reaction would have been.
Yeah, maybe they would have shot me, and to be honest, that would have been fair play. I think I would have shot me as well. But it's weird being like the communist, sort of old-fashioned communist country or regime that they've got there. There's lots of military around, and you see the convoys, and there's nowhere to hide because there's no trees up on the plateau. So you'd see like a convoy coming, and what I discovered, they want you to be leaving Tibet. So when you'd see them coming, you'd jump off the bike, turn it round, cross the road, and point it back towards China and pretend to have a drink and wave at them. And because they saw the bike pointing back towards China, and you're not trying to hide, you're kind of openly hiding and waving at them, it was always fine. If I tried to hide behind a rock, I'm sure they would have stopped and asked for papers and stuff like that. And I picked that up because everyone always assumes you're going in the direction your bike's pointing. And that worked a treat. Really, really simple. I
hope the Chinese embassy are not listening to this podcast. You're giving away all the secrets of cycle tourists who want to travel through Tibet. Did you have any particular disasters when you were travelling?
Not really. I mean, mechanically wise, I broke 9 spokes on that trip in total. That was it. The bike was fine. It's very simple. I mean, the bars broke in Serbia, and I fell off because they snapped. And then at the top of the hill, a guy had seen me, and he welded them up for me and had a tool as a chisel or something, and he cut the handle off, cut the chisel part off, and put a brace across the bars, and it's still on there to this day. And I've never repaired them properly again because that's all part of the story. But I've been, on the original trip, I had a few near misses, but was never robbed or anything. So people are nice. That's the thing. No real disasters. I got dysentery, so that was probably the low point on that trip, and in eastern Turkey. So that was 10 days of instant weight loss, and kind of learnt the lesson of take antibiotics with you next time. But that was my own fault entirely, because I had to run out of water one day, and it was just there was no villages, no little streams or anything to get any water from, and no cars to stop. And I came across a farmer's irrigation pump pumping water out, and I drank and drank and drank, and it was the best water I'd ever tasted. It was also the worst water I'd ever tasted. I had iodine tablets with me as well, which I didn't use, so my own fault. But it was a lesson learned, so always carry antibiotics.
Presumably you were camping while you were doing your trip, so you must have had a fair bit of luggage on the bike itself. How do you actually arrange the carrying of the luggage on a penny-farthing?
So compared to a normal touring cyclist, I've got I use front panniers, so the 2 small front panniers you'd normally have, and I put them one above the other behind the seat, so they just go there. Small tent in between, and the bar bag I have just my food. And then backpack I have for cameras and things. Because of the solid tyres, you can't carry anything electronic in the bags because the vibrations are just over time just destroy them. So I just carry those in the backpack. But I do travel light compared to a normal touring cyclist. And then obviously water, you carry as much water as you possibly can. Depending on where you are, I've got lots of bottle holders and stuff, and on the bike, just to, if possible, to carry as much water as you can. I keep it nice and simple, and when I've met other touring cyclists and seen how much they can carry, I'm amazed. I'm probably carrying more similar to like a bike packer would carry. Yeah, I can't take much.
Ed Pratt, when he cycled around the world on his unicycle, he actually took a really small amount of luggage with him, didn't he? He had a bag that was kind of shaped around the wheel, his only wheel. But yeah, that was real minimalist cycling.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It just shows what you can do. They had the tri-bars on there, and they had brakes on them as well, which is amazing to me. And that's very much a bikepacking thing. I've never met Ed, but I've rode with a unicyclist in Mexico, and he'd ridden from Montreal. I think he started, and he had a 2-speed hub in there as well. And he could get up hills much better than I could. And he had tri-bars on there, he had brakes on the thing as well. It's amazing. And it was good because we ended up with a bit of a group of us travelling together down Baja in Mexico, and there was a French couple. They had 2 trikes with trailers on. One trailer had all their camping gear, the other had a 40-kilogram Rottweiler in. There's Felix on the unicycle, Reto, who was just a complete eccentric Swiss guy. It was great. It was really, really good. And for people watching it, it was kind of, it must have been like, is the circus in town? Because we did look a little bit like that.
Well, I was about to say, it sounds like a travelling circus, seeing all those kind of people on those kind of bikes, yeah. Are your penny-farthing touring days behind you, or have you got more plans for future rides?
No, not at all. At the moment, it's doing probably like shorter rides. So 2018, I did the first circumnavigation of Iceland on a penny-farthing. That was stunning country, absolutely stunning country. Very expensive, but a stunning country. Then 2019, I did the North Coast 500 around Scotland. Again, beautiful route, absolutely beautiful route. I'd never been out to the west of Scotland. Yeah, stunning out there. Obviously last year, then nothing at all. So this year, once hopefully by the summer you can get a better idea, I would imagine it would be something, just perhaps a 2 or 3 week thing this year. Once the world hopefully becomes a little bit more normal, and then plan something, a bit more of an expedition, something for next year. But the multi-year trips, I'll never say never. I mean, I've still got the inkling of doing Cape to Cape, so Nordkapper to South Africa. So because I've never been to Africa, so that one's in the back of my mind for the future, but not anytime soon for that one.
And finally, if you were going to give some advice to anybody who wanted to be a long-distance penny-farthing rider of the future, what would your advice be?
Oh, just do it. Nothing's impossible. That's the thing. Nothing is impossible. And people that go on these trips, and I did, you read the books and things of people doing them. They're just normal people, and they just put their mind to it, and they can do it. And it's not about getting sponsorship or anything like that. If you really want to do it, you'll do it. I mean, I had no sponsorship. I just worked hard, saved up, sold everything I owned, and my budget was £5 a day. So it's completely feasible for anyone to go and do it. And guy or girl, it makes no difference at all. The world is there, and specifically penny farthing wise, then there's a great group on Facebook called the League of Ordinary Riders. Everyone's happy to give you help. There's people making the bikes, and not just me. Who you can buy a bike from. They'll fit it to your size. They'll give you advice. It's completely doable. If you just want one, then it's there. Or if you want to go out on a touring bike, then just go touring, do short rides, and you'll be puffed out. Yes. Then the second day you won't be quite so puffed out, and it gets better and better, and nothing's impossible. People around the world are lovely. So 99.999% of people will help you out, give you a wonderful experience, or just give you a smile and a wave, and that can lift you on a tough day by itself. But if someone's listening to this and they just want to go on a bike tour, they've never done it, then it'll change your life. It's really life changing, and just couldn't recommend it more highly.
And finally, if they want to see you in action, where can they? You've got videos and things, I think.
Yeah. I've got a YouTube, and just search for Joff Summerfield. I've got a YouTube channel on there. So the last long trip I did, I cycled from Toronto, started in Toronto, and ended in Ecuador, and that was a year and a half, 10,500 mile trip. That one I did video, so that's on there, so you can go and check that out. I'm editing still the Iceland trip, and I haven't started editing the North Coast 500 trip yet, but I did film all that, so that will be coming to go on there. But yeah, just there, or on Instagram as well. I'm on there, so just Joff Summerfield, and you can find me on there.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been great. Love your podcast. It's I say it sounds so good, and it's great to hear other people's inspiring stories. And like the girls in the Tandem talking about before, and their amazing adventure around the world, and I'm glad they took time to see stuff as well, which was great. And and for them, I'm sure it's changed their lives. Inspires them and makes them realise, whatever they want to do, they can go and do it. And even as well, when people meet you on your bike, whether you're riding a normal touring bike, a penny farthing, a tandem, and you tell them your story, where you've come from, that inspires people to go off and do or face their own challenges, and that's such a feel-good factor for yourself. And even from that, it's worth it, and sort of justifies you sort of spending that time on the road.
So that was episode 30 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thank you, Joff. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Rachel, for your contributions to this episode of the podcast. If you'd like to make your own contribution to the podcast, then please feel free to get in touch, and you can find all the contact details by visiting cyclingeurope.org. So until the next time, thank you for listening, and happy cycling.